Alright, so tonight we're diving into 2 Samuel chapters 10 and 11, and wow, there's a lot happening here. We've got David, the king, at the height of his power, big battles, huge victories, and then, well, some really human struggles that follow. I mean, we're talking strategy, politics, but also temptation and personal failure. Stick with me. Because these chapters aren't just history, they're full of lessons about pride, opportunity, and what happens when power meets weakness. Let's jump in, okay? So let's start with this part of the story in 2 Samuel chapter 10. David is in this really interesting position here. The kingdom of Israel is at its peak, militarily strong, economically wealthy, borders expanded. He's experienced peace for a while, and it's kind of this moment where, he's looking around and thinking, okay, who can I show kindness to now? And this is where Hanun, the son of Nahash, comes into the picture. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, had passed away, and now his son, Hanun, is on the throne. David, remembering that Nahash had been kind to him in the past, decides he wants to extend that same kindness to Hanun. And here's the thing, this isn't just political nicety. This actually mirrors something really beautiful that happened in chapter 9 with Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. If you remember, Mephibosheth was crippled in both feet, shunned, overlooked by society, and David went out of his way to show him kindness, to bring him to the king's table, to honor him for Jonathan's sake. That story is often seen as a kind of picture of Christ showing mercy to us, right? We're spiritually crippled, flawed, broken in ways that might keep us from God's presence. But David's actions reflect a heart of mercy and grace that lifts the undeserving into honor. So in chapter 10, David is in this same mode of kindness. He's not looking for war or revenge. He's defeated his enemies. Israel is strong, and his heart is turning toward mercy. He thinks, okay, Hanun's father was kind to me. I should return that favor. That's where David's mindset is. And it's really refreshing because it shows a pattern in his life. Kindness isn't just for the convenient or the familiar. It's intentional, thoughtful, and sometimes risky. So David sends envoys, his servants, to Hanun to convey condolences on the death of his father. This is completely normal and peaceful. You'd think, mourning a king's death. Receiving condolences from a foreign king, this is standard diplomatic courtesy. But here's where it gets tricky. Hanun is surrounded by advisors, counselors, people who are supposed to give him wise guidance. And here's the catch, they're not giving good advice. Not even close. They take one look at David's gesture and immediately assume, nope, this isn't about kindness. This is espionage. They're telling Hanun, David's not sending condolences. He's sending spies. He wants to check out the city, gather intelligence, and then he'll attack you. Talk about a leap, right? And here's the thing, these advisors are confident. They're sure that David is up to no good. And Hanun, probably inexperienced and not wanting to appear weak, buys into it. So instead of seeing this as an act of mercy, he sees a threat and then he reacts in the most provocative way possible. What does Hanun do? He humiliates David's envoys in a way that's both absurd and, well, kind of shocking to our modern eyes. He shaves off half of their beards. Now, in that culture, men wore beards, and being clean-shaven was reserved for slaves or servants. So this is more than cosmetic, it's deeply degrading. But wait, there's more. He doesn't just stop at the beards, he cuts their garments right at the waist, exposing their buttocks. So these men show up in royal robes, on a peaceful mission, probably expecting a polite reception, and they are literally shamed in front of everyone. Their dignity is stripped away, almost physically, in a very public manner. And here's the thing, the absurdity of this is hard to ignore. You have these envoys, representing a powerful king meant to convey condolences, and instead they're paraded around humiliated in a way that's almost cartoonish. And yet, in that absurdity lies the tension that sets the stage for conflict. This isn't just an insult, it's a declaration of hostility, whether Hanun intended it as such or not. And David, being the strategic and patient leader that he is, responds in a measured way. When he hears what's happened, he doesn't immediately go to war or fly off the handle. He understands the shame his envoys feel. They've been publicly disgraced, and he tells them to stay in Jericho until their beards grow back. It's like he's saying, okay, we're not going to let this disrespect define us. Wait, regain some dignity, and then we'll handle this situation. It's a response that mixes wisdom, restraint, and an understanding of human emotion. He knows pride is involved on both sides, and he's handling it with care, while also setting up for what's coming next. Now, let's think about the broader picture. Hanun and the Ammonite people realize the gravity of their miscalculation. They've provoked David, a king whose military and political influence is unmatched at this point, and their reaction. They start hiring allies Syrians from different regions, the king of Makkah, and others to strengthen their position for the inevitable conflict. They're realizing, okay, we may have poked a hornet's nest, and now we need to brace ourselves. But here's the ironic twist: all of this escalation is rooted in suspicion, bad advice, and a failure to see an act of kindness for what it really was. A peaceful gesture intended to extend mercy, spiraled into military mobilization, alliances, and the brink of war, all because of misjudgment and paranoia. And that's a pretty universal lesson, right? Sometimes our overreactions, fueled by fear or misinformation, escalate situations unnecessarily. It's a moment that's both dramatic in the narrative and relatable in human behavior. What I love about this part of the story is how it blends the human and the divine. On one level, you have the political drama, the envoys humiliated, the bad counsel, the preparation for war. On another level, you see the thread of God's hand in David's actions. David's desire to show kindness isn't just political, it's a reflection of a moral and spiritual principle that's consistent throughout his life. He doesn't act out of revenge or pride here. He acts out of mercy, and that's powerful, because even when the humans around him misinterpret his actions, even when conflict seems inevitable, the principle of kindness remains steadfast. It's almost like a quiet reminder that integrity and mercy can persist, even in the face of misunderstanding and hostility. And then there's the tension and absurdity of the humiliation itself. I mean, imagine this scene: David's envoys arrive, dressed in royal robes, with a peaceful mission. They're met not with condolences or welcome, but with a public shaming involving half-shaved beards and exposed garments. It's bizarre, almost comical in its ridiculousness, yet it's loaded with tension and meaning. It's a form of psychological warfare, designed to provoke, intimidate, and embarrass. And it works, in the sense that it forces David to respond, but it also backfires, because it sets in motion a chain of events that ultimately mobilizes Israel's military might. So the very act intended to assert dominance and insult instead triggers David's strategic and measured response, leading to a situation that's far more serious than Hanun probably intended. And here's something else to consider. The story emphasizes the importance of wise counsel and discernment. Hanun's advisors give him terrible advice, and he follows it without question. That single error, trusting bad counsel over discernment, leads to national humiliation, military escalation, and eventually war. It's a stark reminder that the people we surround ourselves with, the advice we take, can have massive consequences. And it's not just political or historical, it's deeply human. Every day, the decisions we make, the people we listen to, and the counsel we follow can amplify or mitigate conflict in our own lives. A simple act of misjudgment can snowball, just like it did here. That's why this part of the story resonates on multiple levels: historical, strategic, moral, and personal. So the narrative here is layered. On the surface, it's political drama and human error, a king humiliated, envoys disgraced, a kingdom preparing for war. But underneath, there's the moral and spiritual thread: David's heart for mercy, his consistency in showing kindness, and the broader lesson about integrity in the face of misunderstanding. It's fascinating because the story doesn't simplify things. It doesn't say, oh, Hanun was just bad and David was just good. It shows complexity, fear, pride, misjudgment, wisdom, mercy, all interacting in ways that escalate events unpredictably. And that's part of what makes the storytelling so compelling. You can see the absurdity, the tension, the human missteps, and yet the underlying principle of kindness persists through it all. And if we zoom out a bit, we can see how this mirrors chapter 9 with Mephibosheth. In both instances, David's pattern is clear. He looks for opportunities to show mercy, to extend kindness, to honor those who were overlooked or indebted to him in some way. With Mephibosheth, it's deeply personal and symbolic. He's physically crippled, representing all who are spiritually broken, and David lifts him into honor. With Hanun, it's political, more strategic, yet the principle is the same. It's mercy without expectation, kindness without agenda, and a willingness to act graciously even when it might not be understood or appreciated. That continuity in David's behavior speaks volumes about his character and about the kind of moral consistency that stands even when surrounded by misunderstanding and misjudgment. And that's the tension, right? The kind of beautiful tension that makes the story so rich. David's heart is for mercy. Hanun's heart is clouded by suspicion, and the envoys are caught in the middle, humiliated. One peaceful gesture escalates into a provocation for war, not because of malice, but because of human misjudgment and poor counsel. It's dramatic, it's absurd, it's tense, and it's deeply human. And it sets up the next series of events, the military response, the battles, the strategies that we're going to get into next. But for this moment, the focus is on the interplay of kindness, misunderstanding, and the consequences of advice taken without discernment. So, in essence, this section of the story isn't just about politics or war, it's about the human heart. It's about how intentions can be misunderstood, how pride and suspicion can escalate situations unnecessarily, and how consistent mercy and integrity can shine through even when circumstances seem chaotic. David shows kindness, Hanun misreads it, and a peaceful gesture spirals toward conflict. And it's in that space, the space between intention and perception, that we see the tension, the drama, and the profound lessons that carry both historical and personal resonance. Alright, now let's get into the meat of the story, the military response, which is just wild when you think about it. So, after Hanun humiliates David's envoys by shaving their beards and cutting their garments, the situation escalates pretty quickly. The Ammonites realize that they've poked the wrong bear here. I mean, David isn't just some small-time ruler, he's the king of Israel. His armies are legendary, and everyone around him knows it. And when you humiliate the king's ambassadors, yeah, that's basically a declaration of war, whether they meant it or not. So what do the Ammonites do? Well, they start looking for backup. They're not dumb. They know David isn't going to just let this slide. They hire mercenaries, Syrians from neighboring regions, including Zobah and Beth-rehob. And they also get the king of Makkah and troops from Ishtab. So now we're talking about a coalition of different groups, each with their own agendas, all preparing for battle. Picture it, tens of thousands of troops, foreign allies showing up with their own military expertise, all because of one stupid misunderstanding fueled by bad advice. It's intense, and honestly, it's kind of a perfect storm for chaos. And yet, all of this is happening because someone didn't bother to think critically about David's intentions. That's the human side of this story, miscommunication and fear spiraling out of control. Now, on David's side, things are calculated. He doesn't rush in personally. He sends Joab, who's not only the commander of Israel's army, but also his nephew. Joab's a seasoned general, and he knows how to handle massive troop movements and battlefield strategy. David entrusts him with the army of the mighty men, his elite fighters, which is basically saying, here's the cream of Israel's military. Make sure this mess doesn't get out of hand. And what's interesting is how the forces line up. The Ammonites put themselves at the city gates, and the Syrians from Zobah, Beth-rehob, and Makkah are in the field. So we've got a multi-front scenario, Ammonites in the city, Syrians outside, preparing to engage Israel in a coordinated strike. It's tense because Joab realizes that if he focuses on one front, the other might overwhelm him. He's got to think strategically, which is exactly what he does. Joab's solution is brilliant in its simplicity. He takes some of Israel's best warriors and sets them against the Syrians, while he places the rest under the command of his brother Abishai to face the Ammonites. So you've got this two-pronged approach, where each flank is responsible for handling a specific enemy, but there's built-in support. If one side struggles, the other comes to help. And here's where the human, almost relatable part comes in before the battle. Joab has this moment with Abishai. Kind of a pep talk. And it's just so real. He says, "Look, if the Syrians are too strong for me, you come help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I'll come help you. Be strong, be courageous, fight for our people, and let the Lord do what is good in his sight. That's it, short, to the point, but layered with trust, responsibility, and encouragement. And it's brilliant because it mirrors life outside of battle, too. We all face situations where we need someone to have our back, and someone else might need us. Joab's speech is basically saying, don't go it alone, support one another, and trust in the bigger picture. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at what's happening on the battlefield. Joab's troops engage the Syrians, and as you'd expect from elite soldiers against foreign mercenaries, the Syrians begin to retreat. And when the Ammonites see their allies fleeing, panic sets in, and they flee as well. They retreat back into their city, probably thinking, okay, this is not going how we planned. Joab, seeing the city secure, returns to Jerusalem, but the Syrians aren't done. They're not going to just accept this defeat. Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, isn't the type to let a loss slide, so he gathers his forces beyond the river, bringing in additional troops to confront Israel. And here comes David personally, crossing the Jordan with all of Israel, setting up the next phase of the conflict. The scale is enormous. We're talking about tens of thousands of soldiers, multiple kingdoms, and strategic maneuvers across a large area. Imagine the coordination required for that. It's massive, and it highlights both the organizational genius of David's military and the sheer chaos that war can create when multiple powers collide. When the final confrontation happens, David's forces are overwhelming. The Syrians flee before Israel, and David kills 700 charioteers and 40,000 horsemen, striking down Shobach, their commander. That's not just a victory, it's a decisive, almost crushing blow that would have sent a clear message to anyone thinking of challenging Israel. And the aftermath is equally important. The other kings and vassals who were allied with Hadadezer see the scale of defeat and make peace, essentially recognizing Israel's dominance. The Syrians become too afraid to assist the Ammonites again. So in a single series of engagements, David and his generals not only defend Israel, but also reinforce Israel's reputation as a formidable power. And it all began with, of all things, that's an insult to a couple of envoys. The contrast is striking. A minor act of humiliation triggers a military response of epic proportions, showing how individual actions can ripple out into history-altering consequences. But let's take a step back from the scale of casualties and armies for a moment, because there's something very human and relatable here. Joab's speech to Abishai isn't just military strategy, it's a lesson in support, courage, and shared responsibility in life. Whether we're facing literal conflicts, personal challenges, or spiritual battles, we often think we have to go it alone. But here, in a very practical, tangible way, the text shows that even in life or death scenarios, collaboration, encouragement, and being there for one another are crucial. It's not enough to have strength individually, it's the collective courage and mutual support that ensures success. And this translates directly into personal and spiritual life too. We need people to walk alongside us, encourage us, pray with us, and sometimes just listen. That support can make all the difference, especially when facing challenges that feel overwhelming. And here's the thing, what David and Joab are doing strategically also mirrors a larger principle about leadership and foresight. Joab positions his best warriors against the strongest external threat while delegating the rest to Abishai to handle the immediate city threat. He sets up a system where there's backup and flexibility. In real life, too, we need that kind of planning, anticipate challenges, position resources wisely, and make sure there's a plan for contingencies. But even more than the tactical brilliance, the human element, the communication, trust, and encouragement makes the strategy effective. Without Joab's speech and his mutual reliance with Abishai, even the best-laid military plan could fail. It's a perfect blend of strategy and relational intelligence. The story also highlights the consequences of poor judgment on the other side. Hanun and his allies underestimated Israel, misjudged David's intentions, and relied on bad counsel. This miscalculation forced them into a war they weren't prepared for. The lesson here, again, resonates beyond history. The advice we take, the assumptions we make, and the people we surround ourselves with can significantly impact outcomes. One rash decision, fueled by fear and misinformation, can lead to chaos and disaster. That's exactly what happens here. The humiliation of David's envoys sets off a chain reaction that escalates to full-scale war. It's dramatic, it's intense, and yet it's completely believable because human nature hasn't really changed. Fear, pride, suspicion, they still drive people to overreact today, just like they did then. And let's not forget the scale of the battles themselves. We're talking tens of thousands of troops on multiple fronts, coordination across rivers and territories, chariots, cavalry, infantry. It's an epic military operation. The logistical and strategic challenges alone are enormous, and David's generals handle it with precision. It's a reminder that preparation, communication, and leadership are essential in high-stakes situations. But even amidst all this military complexity, the personal and relational elements remain central. The courage to act together, the willingness to support one another, and the moral grounding in doing what is right are just as important as the weapons and numbers. Without these human elements, the military strategy would fail. So the story is layered, it's political, it's tactical, it's relational, and it's ethical all at once. And here's something I find fascinating. This whole conflict begins with a simple act of kindness. David didn't need to engage in this war. It was provoked by Hanun's misinterpretation and bad advice. So the story emphasizes the ripple effect of actions and perceptions. One kind act, misread, leads to humiliation, which leads to war, which leads to massive casualties. And yet, through all of this, the principles of leadership, courage, mutual support, and moral integrity shine through on David's side. There's an almost poetic contrast between the chaos caused by fear and suspicion on one side and the disciplined, morally grounded response on the other. It's a vivid illustration of how character and wisdom can shape outcomes, even in the midst of overwhelming conflict. So if we pull all of this together, this section of the story isn't just about military maneuvers or ancient battles. It's about how human emotions, leadership, strategy, and relationships intersect under pressure. It's about courage in the face of intimidation, trust in one another, and the way moral principles guide decisions even in the chaos of war. And the lessons are timeless: support one another, be courageous, plan wisely, and always be aware of how bad counsel or poor judgment can escalate situations. The narrative works on multiple levels. It's epic in scope, rich in human drama, and deeply instructive about character and community. And when we read it, we can't help but react both to the scale of the battle and to the human dynamics that make it all unfold the way it does. The story also shows how interdependent success is. Joab doesn't just tell Abishai, "Hey, do your thing while I do mine." He sets up a system where they rely on each other. If one side falters, the other comes to help. That's a really profound lesson for life, right? We all have our battles, our struggles, and sometimes it's not enough to try to fight alone. Whether it's work, family, or spiritual growth, having someone to back you up, to encourage you, and to share the load can be the difference between failure and success. Joab's simple, heartfelt words to Abishai, "Be courageous, be strong, and support each other," are timeless advice that applies far beyond the battlefield. And the beauty of this story is that it shows the principle in action. Israel's victory isn't just about numbers or strategy, it's about unity, courage, and mutual support. And finally, the consequences are clear. The Ammonites and their allies suffer a massive defeat, and David's reputation as a strong and divinely supported leader is solidified. But the real takeaway isn't just the military outcome, it's the human and spiritual lessons. Courage, collaboration, discernment, moral integrity, and the wisdom to rely on God's guidance are highlighted throughout. Even in the chaos of battle, these principles guide the Israelites to victory, showing that success isn't just about brute force, but also about character, relationship, and strategic thinking. So as we wrap up this part of the story, it's hard not to be struck by the scale, drama, and human depth of these events. The Ammonites' overreaction, the coalition of foreign forces, Joab's tactical brilliance, the two-pronged defense, and the encouragement he gives Abishai, all of it combines into a narrative that is epic and profoundly human. And embedded within it are lessons that we can take into our own lives: lean on one another, support each other through challenges, plan wisely, and act with integrity even when faced with chaos. That's the richness of this part of 2 Samuel. It's history, drama, and life lessons all rolled into one compelling story. Okay, So now we're moving from the battlefield into something a little more subtle, but just as dangerous, this idea of what military historians call victory disease. And honestly, it's one of those things that when you hear it, it just clicks because it's so human, right? The term comes from modern history, from World War II, but the principle is timeless. It's what happens when a nation or a person has experienced a string of wins, and those wins start to breed overconfidence, complacency, and sometimes arrogance. You start to think, I've got this. Nothing can touch me. And that mindset can be the setup for some really big mistakes. And that's exactly where David finds himself at the start of chapter 11. Israel has been winning on all fronts. David has defeated enemies, expanded borders, strengthened his army, and established peace in his kingdom. From an outside perspective, it looks like everything is perfect. But here's the thing, David, being human, starts to get a little too comfortable. He's had so many victories that he begins to take them for granted. There's a routine that develops. The expectation of success becomes almost automatic. He's not just confident, he's almost numb to the risk. And that's the danger. The enemy hasn't necessarily changed, but David's perspective he's psychologically shifted from alert, battle-ready king to a man who thinks, I can handle anything. And I don't even need to be there in person to make sure things go right. That's the perfect storm for what's about to happen. So here's the moment that really signals the shift. It's spring, the traditional time when kings go out to battle. Israel's army is engaged against the Ammonites, with Joab leading the troops, just like we talked about. But David doesn't go. He stays behind in Jerusalem, in the palace. And when you think about it, that's kind of a big deal. In that era, kings often led their armies in person, showing courage and providing leadership. David's absence isn't just a minor detail, it's a reflection of how comfortable and perhaps complacent he has become. He's experienced so many victories. He's probably thinking, my generals have this. The army is strong. There's no need for me to risk myself. And this mindset, this stepping back because you feel invincible, is exactly what victory disease is all about. Let's break down the symptoms for a second, because it's kind of fascinating. The first one is arrogance. David, intentionally or not, begins to feel untouchable. All these successes reinforce this belief. Arrogance doesn't just affect judgment, it changes behavior. You start making choices not based on strategy or wisdom, but on the assumption that you can't fail. The second symptom is complacency. Repeated success can lull anyone into a false sense of security. You stop being as vigilant because things have worked out so far, so why change your habits? And the third symptom is routine or rigidity, sticking to a pattern that worked in the past without considering new risks or circumstances. Combine those three, and you've got a leader who is blind to vulnerability. Even someone as seasoned as David. Now, staying in Jerusalem isn't inherently bad. It's practical in some ways. He's the king, he's overseeing the nation. But in the context of victory disease, it's revealing that by not going out to battle, David inadvertently puts himself in a situation where he's exposed to temptation. He's in the palace, in the wrong place at the wrong time, away from the responsibilities and focus of his normal role as a king at war. And humans, whether we're kings or not, are vulnerable when routine lulls us into comfort. When we stop paying attention, that's when opportunity creeps in, and in David's case, that opportunity leads to his greatest personal struggle, the encounter with Bathsheba. His overconfidence and sense of invulnerability blind him to the risk that's right in front of him. This is the part of the story that feels so relatable. Think about your own life for a moment. Look, how many times have we gotten comfortable because we've succeeded repeatedly? Maybe it's at work, in school, in a sport, or even in personal habits. Repeated wins can create a mental pattern where we underestimate challenges or ignore warning signs. It doesn't mean the risk isn't there. It just means we fail to notice it because we've grown too confident in our abilities or our track record. David's story shows this vividly. He's not careless in a reckless way. He's careless in a very human, understandable way. He's lulled into a false sense of security by his string of victories. And there's something something else worth noting, routine can be surprisingly dangerous. David has a schedule, a set way of operating, and when everything is predictable, it creates blind spots. In his case, staying in Jerusalem becomes part of that routine. He's no longer actively engaged in the external battles, so he's free to wander the palace, literally and metaphorically. And that's how temptation finds its way in. When we become too comfortable, when our lives fall into predictable patterns without awareness or mindfulness, we make ourselves vulnerable to things we wouldn't normally face. That's exactly what happens here. The moment David steps out of his usual role, he encounters temptation, and because he's unprepared and overconfident, it quickly escalates into sin. So, in a way, victory disease isn't just about overconfidence, it's about how repeated success can dull our vigilance and blind us to our own vulnerabilities. David's military prowess had brought him victories, respect, and security, but it also created a psychological environment where he was less attentive to the subtle dangers that always exist, particularly the dangers within our own hearts. And that's a lesson that hits home. Success can make anyone vulnerable if it leads to complacency, arrogance, and a reliance on routine instead of constant awareness and humility. The stakes might not always be life and death in our daily lives, but the principle is the same. Letting repeated wins make you blind to risk or temptation can lead to moments where your integrity, your judgment, or your character is tested. So, as we transition into chapter 11, keep this in mind. David's greatest challenge isn't on the battlefield. It's personal, internal, and profoundly human. His overconfidence and complacency, a direct result of his string of victories, set the stage for this next chapter. He's not invincible. In fact, he's dangerously vulnerable. And the story here is relatable because we've all experienced moments where we thought we had everything under control, only to realize that comfort and repeated success can create blind spots that put us at risk. David's story is a cautionary tale about vigilance, humility, and the dangers of letting victory make us overconfident. Alright, now we get into one of the most famous and, honestly, most humanly relatable moments in the Bible, David and Bathsheba. And when you read it, you can really see how temptation unfolds in a way that feels almost like it could happen to anyone if the circumstances line up. So picture this. It's the spring of the year, which is traditionally when kings went out to battle. Israel is at war. Joab is leading the army, doing all the fighting, but David, he's back in Jerusalem. And this, right here, is the first vulnerability that sets the stage for what's about to happen. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Literally off the battlefield, comfortable in his palace, removed from responsibility, and not focused on what he should be focused on. This is the perfect example of what we talked about with victory disease. He's overconfident, complacent, and his routine has made him blind to risk. So one evening, David arises from his bed and walks out onto the roof of the king's house. Now, you might think, okay, he's creeping around or spying. But the roofs of houses back then were common living spaces, especially in hot climates. They were extensions of the home, places where people could get a breeze, relax, and think. So David isn't sneaking, he's just up there, observing, maybe taking a little mental break, but then bam, he sees her. Bathsheba is bathing, and the text is specific. She's very beautiful to behold, not just pretty, but very beautiful. The language emphasizes it, and, well, here's the tension already. David sees her, and the human flesh, the unredeemed part of him, reacts. He's a man, she's beautiful, and temptation begins its work. Now, this first step he saw her isn't sin in itself. Seeing someone attractive isn't automatically lust or wrongdoing. But it's the spark, and the spark matters because it sets the stage for the next steps. Temptation needs opportunity to become sin. If he had simply looked and walked away, that could have been it. But he doesn't stop there. He inquires about her. He asks, "Who is this woman?" That's the second step. Curiosity combined with desire. Still not sin, but it's inching closer. The moment he starts seeking her out, he's creating the conditions where temptation can take root. And you can almost imagine the internal tension here: his spirit, his regenerated self that wants to honor God, and his flesh, that unredeemed part that still craves, still reacts, are in conflict. And that's something every believer can relate to: the battle between what you know is right and the desires that still exist in the flesh. So then comes the third step he sends for her. Now, the inquiring transforms into action. This is a moment where choice comes into play. The opportunity that arose from seeing her and inquiring about her becomes actionable. David could have stopped. He could have said, okay, curiosity noted, now I walk away, But instead, he exercises that opportunity. He sends messengers and she comes to him. And just like that, temptation has moved from observation to pursuit. And this is where the story really illustrates a principle that's easy to miss. If you read too fast, temptation alone isn't sin. But when opportunity is taken and action is chosen, sin enters the picture. And here, the progression is clear: saw, inquired, took, lay. It's like a ladder. One step leads to another. And it's subtle, because each step in isolation might not feel like a huge moral failure, but collectively, they lead to sin. And then the fourth step: he lay with her. He sleeps with her. That's the culmination of the progression. Now it's sin, plain and simple. But the story doesn't just leave it there. It's almost clinical in its description. She was cleansed from her impurity according to the law. She returned to her house, and she became pregnant. The narrative is straightforward, almost detached. But when you consider the human drama, it's intense. David has given in to the desires of the flesh, while his spirit, his renewed heart, knows better. This tension between spirit and flesh is palpable. It's the same tension that Paul describes in Romans 7 and 8, the things we want to do to honor God. We often fail at because our flesh still seeks its own satisfaction. And here, the story makes it clear even a man after God's own heart is not immune to this struggle. Let's pause for a second and think about what this teaches us about temptation in our own lives. First, temptation is progressive. It doesn't hit all at once. It starts small, with a look, a thought, a curiosity. Left unchecked, it escalates. And the story makes it really tangible. David could have stopped at any stage, but each step built on the previous one. Second, opportunity is what allows temptation to become sin. The wrong place at the wrong time. A moment of boredom, routine, complacency. All these conditions are the opportunity. That's why David being in Jerusalem instead of the battlefield is so important. He's physically and mentally positioned in a way that makes sin more accessible. It's not that God is tempting him, it's that the conditions make it possible for temptation to flourish. And that's the part that hits home. How many times do we find ourselves in situations where we're not technically doing anything wrong, but the conditions around us, the environment, the people, the routine make it easy to stumble? And then there's the human reaction to desire itself. We can't pretend it's not there. David's flesh reacted naturally, as anyone's would. But the story highlights the choice he makes in response to that reaction. That's the crucial moment. Our desires aren't sin. What we do with them determines whether sin happens. David's choice to send for Bathsheba transforms desire into action, into sin, and it's so human, right? The tension between seeing what's right and giving in to what feels satisfying is universal. And this is why the story resonates. It's not a distant, unreal moral lesson. It's a real human experience laid bare. And the narrative does something else interesting. It gives us verbs to follow. Circle or note them if you're reading along. Saw, inquired, took, lay. Each one is a step in the progression. Each one is a choice, a moment where action could have gone one way or another. And that's the beauty and the danger of temptation's small steps. If unchecked, lead somewhere we may regret deeply. The story is like a roadmap of how temptation can escalate and why vigilance is required at every stage. It's relatable because it's not just about David, it's about every one of us. We all face situations where we see something, we inquire about it, we take a step toward it, and suddenly we've crossed a line we never intended to. And so, as we reflect on this, the tension between spirit and flesh comes into sharp focus. David's spirit is renewed, aligned with God, wanting to do what is right. But the flesh, well, it still has desires, impulses, weaknesses. That's the human condition, and the story doesn't shy away from it. In fact, it illustrates it with clarity. We see the choices, the progression, the opportunity, and the consequence. And that's why this part of the narrative is so powerful. It's a cautionary tale about paying attention to the small steps, about understanding that temptation itself isn't sin, but opportunity plus action can quickly lead there. And it's a story that feels close to home because, honestly, we all face these tensions every day, in one form or another. We all know what it's like to see, to desire, and to have to make a choice about what we do next. So, in sum, this section of David and Bathsheba isn't just about the act itself. It's about the human process of temptation, the progression from sight to action, and the way opportunity can lead us into sin if we're not vigilant. It shows the tension between spirit and flesh, the subtle escalation of desire, and the consequences that follow, and it keeps the listener engaged because it's not a lecture, it's human, it's raw, and it's relatable. The verbs, the steps, the choices, they all draw us into the story, and they give us lessons that extend far beyond David and Bathsheba. It's about being aware, being vigilant, and understanding that even good people, even strong people, can be vulnerable if opportunity meets unchecked desire. Alright, let's step back for a minute and look at some of the principles we can pull from David's encounter with Bathsheba, because it's not just a story about sin, it's a roadmap for understanding temptation and how we deal with it in our own lives. First off, one of the clearest lessons is that temptation is progressive. It doesn't usually hit all at once. It starts small, maybe just a glance, a thought, a curiosity, and if we indulge it or follow it, it starts to build momentum. In David's case, it started with seeing Bathsheba on the roof. That's just a natural reaction. It's the spark. Then he inquired about her, sending messengers to find out who she was. That's the next step. Curiosity mixed with desire. Then he took action and sent for her to come to him. And finally, he lay with her. Each step was a choice. Each step allowed the previous temptation to escalate until it became sin. And that's the part that really hits home. It's rarely just one moment. It's a series of choices, a progression, and recognizing that progression is the first way we can guard ourselves. If we notice that spark early, we have the chance to stop it before it snowballs. But here's the good news, and it's actually pretty comforting. Every temptation comes with an exit. God doesn't tempt us without giving us a way to resist. 1 Corinthians 10:13 tells us that no temptation is beyond what we can bear, and God provides a way out so we can stand under it. That's huge, right? It means that in every situation where we feel pulled towards something we shouldn't, there's a choice available. There's an exit ramp, even if it's hard to see in the moment. For David, the stairs down from the roof could have been that exit. He could have turned around, walked back into the palace, refocused on his responsibilities as king, and that would have been it. The opportunity to sin would have been there, but he didn't take it. And that's the key point. God gives the way out, but we have to take it. It doesn't force us, it's there, ready for us to choose. And here's where it gets personal. This principle is so human because it requires responsibility. You can't say, "Oh, I had no choice," because the choice is always there. The temptation is real. The desire is real, but the way out is also real. It's kind of like being at a crossroads, and one path is the easy, tempting one, and the other is the harder, wiser one, but the option to take the wise one exists. And that's where our responsibility comes in. Even though David was king, even though he had so much authority and success, he was still human. He still had to make a choice in the moment. And just like David, we face moments where temptation shows up, sometimes small, sometimes massive. And in those moments, the exit is there, provided by God, but we have to take it. We can't just sit there and hope it goes away. One more thing to notice here is how subtle the progression is. David didn't wake up and immediately sin to Issy. Each step seems small and manageable. Seeing, inquiring, sending messengers, these steps probably didn't feel like big moral failures at the time. And that's exactly what makes temptation so tricky. Often, we think, I'm just noticing, I'm just thinking, I'm just curious. And that's true. But if we follow each step, the small choices accumulate until we've gone way farther than we ever intended. It's kind of like a slippery slope. That's why awareness and mindfulness are so important. Recognizing the progression gives us the chance to intervene early, to take the exit before temptation snowballs into sin. And there's a very human side to this too. We all have desires, impulses, weaknesses. None of us are perfect. The story of David reminds us that even someone considered a man after God's own heart is not immune to temptation. We can't rely on our status, our intelligence, our past victories, or even our good intentions to keep us safe. The opportunity is always there, and so is the choice. The good news is that God has provided a way out every single time. It's part of His grace and wisdom, but it's up to us to take it. That's why personal responsibility, humility, and awareness are so crucial at recognizing that temptation is progressive and that there's always a way out puts the power in our hands to make the right choice. So the takeaways are really simple, but they're deep. First, be aware of how temptation escalates step by step. Don't ignore the small sparks. Second, remember that there's always an exit. God provides it, even when it's not obvious. And third, take responsibility for your choices. You can't blame the temptation, the circumstances, or anyone else. The way out is there, and you have to choose it. That's the practical, real-life application of this story. It's not just about David or Bathsheba. It's about understanding how our own hearts work, how desire and opportunity interact, and how God equips us to navigate those moments. And the human side of this? Sometimes we stumble, sometimes we fail, and that's part of being human. But knowing the principles, seeing the patterns, and trusting that God provides a way out gives us hope and direction for the next time temptation comes our way. Alright, now we're getting into the part of the story that is really heavy and honestly heartbreaking, the consequences of David's choices and how sin can compound if left unchecked. So, after David has his encounter with Bathsheba and she becomes pregnant, he faces a dilemma. He's aware of the gravity of what's happened. And here's where human nature kicks in. He tries to cover it up rather than confess it immediately. This is the point where the story illustrates a very painful principle. Unconfessed sin often grows, spirals, and leads to further wrongdoing. David's first attempt at covering up the situation is to call Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, back from the battlefield. He's trying to manipulate circumstances to make it look as though the child could be Uriah's. Imagine that he's bringing Uriah home under the guise of rest. Perhaps a little R&R, and even sends a gift along with him. David's plan is to have Uriah go home, sleep with his wife, and in this way cover up the pregnancy. On the surface, it seems like a simple, practical solution, but beneath it is deception, moral compromise, and a tragic lack of foresight. Here's where it gets interesting and also morally weighty. Uriah, a loyal and honorable man, doesn't go home. He refuses to enjoy the comforts of domestic life while the Ark of Israel and the army are encamped in the field. He sleeps at the entrance of the king's house with the servants, demonstrating extraordinary loyalty and integrity. David tries again, encouraging him to go home, to eat and drink, to relax, and to lie with his wife. Uriah still refuses, and this is where the story exposes the full weight of human sin. The consequences of previous choices now force David to escalate his actions. He can't simply cover it up through normal means, and his desperation leads him into deeper moral compromise. David's next attempt is to get Uriah drunk, thinking that perhaps alcohol will loosen his moral resolve. He arranges for him to eat and drink, to enjoy some indulgence, hoping that inebriation will make Uriah act in the way David wants. But once again, Uriah refuses. His character, his loyalty, his sense of honor, and perhaps his faith keep him from succumbing to the scheme. And at this point, the tension in the narrative is palpable. David has escalated from temptation to sin, and now he's entering into calculated moral wrongdoing. This is a moment where we see how compounding sin works. One choice leads to another, and the stakes get higher and higher. Unable to manipulate Uriah through these attempts, David takes the tragic and morally devastating step. He writes a letter to Joab, his general, instructing him to place Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest battle and then withdraw support so that Uriah would be struck down. This is premeditated, deliberate action to ensure the death of an innocent man to cover up a sin. And the narrative doesn't shy away from the horror of this. Joab follows the instructions, positions Uriah in the danger zone, and during the assault, Uriah is killed along with others. David's attempt to hide his sin has now resulted in another grave sin murder, and this is exactly the principle of compounding sin. One misstep, if unconfessed, escalates into further wrongdoing, making the situation far worse than it initially was. Now, consider the human and emotional side of this. Bathsheba, the innocent party in all of this, is left grieving for her husband. She mourns deeply, unaware of the manipulations and the depth of the moral failure taking place. Her pain is real and raw, and David's actions compound the tragedy. Not only has she lost her husband, but she's caught in a web of deceit and moral compromise that she did not create. And yet, the story carefully presents the narrative in a way that holds David fully accountable. While some might speculate about her responsibility, the Bible emphasizes that God holds David accountable. He is the one whose actions have displeased the Lord, whose choices have led to death, grief, and dishonor. And this is such a heavy, sobering moment because it shows how sin doesn't just affect the person committing it, it ripples outward, causing harm, grief, and chaos for others. After Uriah's death, David brings Bathsheba into his house, and she becomes his wife and bears a son. On the surface, you might think the situation is resolved, but the moral weight lingers. David's actions have long-term consequences, not just spiritually, but relationally and politically. He has violated multiple commandments, and the ripple effects of this act will shape his life, his family, and even the kingdom. The narrative doesn't just leave us with the act of adultery, it presents the full arc of sin escalating and the devastation that follows. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when we try to cover sin instead of confronting it, confessing it, and seeking restoration. And here's where the empathy in the story comes in. David is human, and the text allows us to see that. We understand why he made some of the choices: fear, desire, the desire to protect his reputation, but that understanding doesn't excuse him. It just makes the story painfully relatable. We all make choices that we later regret, and sometimes one poor choice leads to another. That's the human condition, and this story lays it bare. It forces us to confront the reality that sin left unaddressed doesn't stay contained, it compounds, affecting more than just the individual. At the same time, the story reminds us of the moral gravity of responsibility. David had power, influence, and knowledge. He knew right from wrong, and yet he acted selfishly, letting desire and fear dictate his decisions rather than his conscience or obedience to God. This is a moment where the narrative teaches us about accountability. It's not just the act itself that matters, it's the choices we make to cover it up, to manipulate, or to avoid responsibility. Those choices amplify the harm, and they underscore the heavy consequences of sin compounding. And even though this section is tragic and difficult to hear, it's also instructive. It highlights several principles. Temptation can lead to sin if not addressed. Unconfessed sin often escalates. Attempts to hide wrongdoing can make things far worse, and moral integrity cannot be circumvented without consequences. The story doesn't spare the reader from the gravity of David's actions, and it's a reminder that our own decisions carry weight, sometimes beyond what we can see in the moment. So as we follow this sequence: adultery, the attempt to manipulate Uriah, the ultimate decision to have him killed, and the grief that follows, we can see the full arc of compounding sin. It's tragic, yes, but also illuminating. It's a story that resonates because it's so human. We make poor choices. We try to cover them up. And often, that cover-up leads to further tragedy. And the lesson here is powerful and enduring. Deal with sin honestly and early, because avoiding it, hiding it, or rationalizing it only increases the harm and deepens the moral consequences. David's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a deeply human one, showing us both the danger of compounding sin and the moral weight of our choices. Okay, so now we reach the part of the story where David's actions catch up with him, and it's a moment that really brings home both the seriousness of sin and the incredible mercy of God. After all that has happened, the adultery, the manipulation, or Uriah's death, David is confronted by Nathan the prophet. Nathan doesn't sugarcoat it. He tells David the truth plainly, holding up a mirror to the gravity of what he's done. And here's the thing that makes this so powerful and relatable. David doesn't argue. He doesn't rationalize. He doesn't try to blame anyone else. He sees his sin, he acknowledges it, and he repents. This is the moment that shows the importance of humility and accountability. Repentance isn't always easy, right? It requires courage, because you have to face the reality of what you've done, including the consequences that can't be undone. David's response models that beautifully. He is a man of great power, yet he approaches his wrongdoing with brokenness. That brokenness is key. It's what allows him to access God's grace. And the story emphasizes that grace in a way that is both comforting and challenging. God doesn't overlook the sin. The consequences remain. They're real and lasting. But God also provides a path for restoration and forgiveness. That's the tension here. The weight of our actions meets the unearned mercy of God. And it's a reminder that no one is beyond correction, and no one is beyond God's grace, even in the midst of serious failure. And this part of the narrative is also a subtle reminder about human frailty. Look, David had everything going for him: success, power, influence, victories on the battlefield, but he was still vulnerable to temptation. Just like any of us. Success, comfort, and routine can all lull us into overconfidence. As we saw with victory disease, temptation is always present, and even the most righteous, the most capable, and the most spiritually attuned are not immune. David's story reminds us that we need awareness and vigilance in our own lives, because human weakness is part of being human. It's not about being perfect, it's about recognizing that weakness and relying on God's grace to guide and sustain us. But here's the encouraging part: even after everything, David's repentance restores his relationship with God. It doesn't erase the consequences of his actions. He still experiences loss and challenges, but it does bring spiritual restoration. That's important for us to remember. Grace doesn't always mean the consequences disappear, but it does mean that healing, forgiveness, and renewed purpose are available. David's willingness to admit his sin, accept responsibility, and turn back to God demonstrates a path forward for all of us. It's about facing the truth honestly, humbling ourselves, and trusting that God's grace can meet us in our brokenness. And there's a deeply human lesson here about accountability. Nathan doesn't confront David to shame him or to belittle him. He does it to help David recognize the seriousness of his actions, to offer the chance for repentance, and to guide him toward restoration. Accountability, whether through a prophet, a mentor, or a trusted friend, is essential in navigating life, especially when we face temptation or make mistakes. David's positive response to correction shows how powerful humility and openness can be. It's a model for how we might receive guidance or correction in our own lives, not with defensiveness, but with reflection and willingness to change. And even beyond personal sin, this moment illustrates the importance of reflection on the broader consequences of our choices. David's actions affected not just himself, but Uriah, Bathsheba, the army, and the kingdom. Recognizing how our actions ripple outward, impacting others, encourages us to take responsibility seriously. Repentance, then, isn't just an inward act, it's an outward acknowledgement of the real-world effects of our decisions, and a commitment to repair where possible. And that's a very relatable lesson. We all make mistakes that affect other people, whether big or small, and facing those honestly is a part of maturity and growth. Finally, David's story leaves us with hope and a warm reminder of God's enduring grace. Despite the magnitude of his failures, he is remembered as a man after God's own heart, not because he was flawless, but because he was repentant and humble. That's significant. It means our value in God's eyes isn't defined by perfection, but by our willingness to recognize our shortcomings, turn back to Him, and live with integrity moving forward. It's about the trajectory, not just a single moment of failure. And that's a comforting, encouraging thought for any of us. Mistakes don't have to define us. Choices to repent, to seek accountability, and to rely on God's grace can redirect us even after serious failure. So as we wrap up this chapter of David's life, the lessons are clear. Temptation is real, even for the strongest among us. Sin left unaddressed can compound and have devastating consequences. But God's grace is available when we humble ourselves and take responsibility. Accountability and correction are not threats. They're opportunities for growth and restoration. And perhaps most importantly, human frailty is universal, but so is the opportunity to return, repent, and receive mercy. David's story reminds us that we all face temptation, we all stumble, but with humility, accountability, and God's grace, restoration is possible, and life can move forward with hope and integrity. So, as we wrap up today, take a moment to reflect on David's story, the temptations he faced, the mistakes he made, and how accountability and humility played a role in his restoration. It's a story that reminds us we all stumble sometimes, but grace and awareness can guide us forward. If you found these lessons meaningful, consider joining us for the next part as we continue exploring David's journey. And hey, if you enjoyed this, a like or a subscription helps us keep diving into these stories together.